Let's go!
There was an interview with Daisuke Ishiwatari, creator of like Guilty Gear, right? Lead dev of Guilty Gear, about the future of the Guilty Gear franchise. And this is just to sort of reiterate my stance on this situation. So, reflecting on 2 years of Guilty Gear Strive, actually a fantastic choice of an article, IGN. Good on you. I think this is really cool to get the impressions of the devs, especially Japanese devs, what they feel about this stuff. Yeah, once again, good on IGN. They this is a great follow-up to sort of reflect on a fighting game that is getting developed over time, because Guilty Gear Strive is likely going to remain a season-based model fighting game where they don't update version after version, because they don't have to, because of an arcade anymore. They don't have to worry about that. I haven't had a chance to play Bedman yet. I'm still waiting on somebody to modify in a Daytona USA car. I'll be willing to pay for it. I will pay for it. The interesting thing that came from this article has been making the rounds quite a bit. IGN asked Daisuke, is there anything that you think you would like to have done differently, or anything on that side of it regarding Guilty Gear Strive's development? And the answer is definitely interesting, and it's something that you wouldn't expect from Guilty Gear, but let's just read over it. So how do I put it? Amongst different, against, you would say, competitive games, fighting games in particular have a high bar of entry. Sure. It's really hard for new people to join in on that. So if there's something that I wish I could do better next time, is to make that a lot easier. Make it easier and simpler for people to be able to just join in the game and really start to enjoy fighting games. Right. Okay. That's a fair take, right? And he doesn't say specifically about things that are gameplay related. He doesn't actually talk about things. The high bar of entry might not even be related to gameplay stuff, right? This isn't really like an issue, in my opinion, but it is definitely what I feel like kind of counterintuitive of what an overall audience could be looking for. I'd argue one of the greatest things that attested to Guilty Gear Strive's like 1 million sales and kind of like FGC blow up that it had, it was the perfect game at the perfect time. I don't feel that everybody had great things to say about Guilty Gear Strive in the first beta. A lot of people forget about the very, very first beta of Strive, which played mostly similar, right? The gameplay wasn't that much different than what it was when it came out. So Guilty Gear Strive version 1 had delay-based netcode. This is before the game actually had rollback, right? The characters look great. Game fairly was functioning the way that, you know, it would when it came out at launch, except for the fact that the netcode was not rollback yet. Nobody was really singing the praises of like Guilty Gear gameplay in that version of the game. It was mostly just a lot of like, yeah, it's essentially like the previous game, but characters got a lot less stuff they can do, and it's a bit more, not grounded footsies, but I use the term like Street Fighter 5e in terms of it turning into like kind of a strike throw fighting game, all that kind of stuff, right? And clearly was not tuned, right? The game was still in an early state, but the conceptual elements of how burst works, how their meter system works, was largely the same. By the time rollback eventually becomes a thing, there's not a lot of fighting games that are coming out, much less ones that are working well online. And the pandemic happens and everyone's kind of stuck at home. And then bam, we get Guilty Gear Strive, and hallelujah, like everybody loves it. My preferred way for fighting games sequels is that accessibility is not specifically a problem. I think the term accessibility is so broad as far as what it can mean. You can sort of get a really weird interpretation of how people feel about any given situation. So with Guilty Gear, the accessibility came in the form of everything got easier to do, right? The accessibility in Guilty Gear Strive is that the characters had less movement. Characters were essentially slower than previous games. Their tools were reconfigured in a way that sort of kept the essence of what they were in previous games, but now they had much less options as a result, right? It was essentially the same exact approach Street Fighter V took to its character roster at the start too. And the big one was damage, right? The damage was crazy high, so any small thing did a ridiculous amount of damage. I don't think that's a bad way of doing things. I think it definitely helped out for the situation of the game, allowing for it to be successful. The thing is, what he's getting out of this situation was that, oh, we made Guilty Gear Strive easy, much easier than all of our previous games. And that was the reason why everybody jumped in. That's what did it. So here's the thing. That game is still too hard. We're going to make the next game even easier. Oh my God. Like, how many special moves are characters going to have in the next game? Like, to me, it's not, it is the opposite of what I would hope that they would pull from the success of Guilty Gear Strive. Granted, it wasn't not like the success of a Capcom game, but 1 million sales is huge for Guilty Gear. My personal thought process behind all of this is I still stand by, I don't like the accessibility part of a fighting game when it's just to simplify things and do nothing else. Just take what has existed and just make it less. Pretty much was what they did for the majority of, like, what they did for Street Fighter, what they did with Mortal Kombat 11, what they did for Guilty Gear Strive. I just don't like that. It is a restrictive on player individuality, kind of like boring games that might not be interesting in a long run. I have no problem with fighting games becoming more accessible in other ways. If you want to make things easier to do for people, sure. Things that are historically ridiculously hard for some players, yeah. If you want to make that easier to do, I get it, man. Like, only the top 5% of people can actually pull off this thing. We want to make it a bit easier to do every once in a while. Yeah, sure, buddy. Here, you can make that a bit easier to do. But you can't just do that. This is my old man ranting, my old tired argument. Your next game can be easier, can be simpler or more accessible, but you have to expand it. Accessible, but expanded. So you have to introduce shit that is completely different than the previous game. It can feel like we're going backwards, you know? Like, visually, yes, amazing. Graphically, yes, great. But if the next game feels like an actual regression in gameplay, that is something that I am highly against. And I don't feel like is the right take. We're just going to slow our game down, and we're just going to take tools away from our characters to sort of focus them on doing this one thing instead of many things, right? So how do you do that, right? And in the older games that came out in the 90s and maybe the 2000s, how do you have accessible but expanded? And I always use the example of Marvel vs. Capcom 2. MVC2 now is largely considered to be a much more crazy game than the previous games before it. But that was not the case when it came out. MVC2 was looked at as the baby game for the first month. And the reason being, they took away the amount of attacks characters had. By reducing the amount of attacks characters had, it was like, oh shit. Oh no, the next game's for babies. This is not what we want. This is terrible. But they did something. They added a complete new character you can put on the team. So instead of 2v2, it turned into 3v3. Huh. Simplified, but expanded. They also allowed you to do assists for your own characters and not just locked character assists. Huh. Simplified but expanded. And that has been the case for a very large majority of fighting games ever since the 90s, where the next game might make things easier to do than the previous game. But the next game is going to introduce concepts that actually expand the title itself, actually bring the title into the next game that makes it feel like something that is actually different. All of the Tekken games have done this, except for Tekken 4. And while Tekken 4 has a lot of redeemable aspects, certainly a ton, it's a great looking game, it's a great sounding game, there's a lot of great aspects to its content and presentation. What it did specifically was regress. They went backwards. We're just going to take away things from how our systems work. We're going to retool some characters, right? And make them focus around this sort of gameplay. And everybody fucking hated it. Certainly a very different game than the games before it. And then what happened again? The next game, they go back on it. We're going to add a bunch more shit. It's going to be like the older games before it. Here's a bunch of new stuff, but it gets a bit easier to play. Bam, Tekken 5 is a huge, giant success. Historically, with a lot of these bigger franchises, a lot of times fighting games will find success in expanding what the game has to offer, but not specifically just limiting everything regarding its gameplay. And yes, over the past 5 to 10 years, there's been a very big focus on a grounded footsie fighting game sort of approach, where most of the games we know from games before are getting slower. Devs look at how do we make our next game appealing, and instead of offering single player content, breathtaking visuals, right, a roster of characters that people are excited to play, instead of focusing on those things that actually sell fighting games, they look at the gameplay and they're like, oh, well, let's just make everything easier. Let's just make everything super simple. I'm not saying that Guilty Gear Strive is guilty of that in every single way. I actually really like the meter system in Strive. I actually like several things in Strive at how different they work than Guilty Gear Xrd, even though I like Xrd more. That doesn't really matter because it's a personal take. But for the most part, like, I've always liked the fact that Guilty Gear characters feel juiced. You know, they feel like they have all this shit that they can do, and they're just fucking absolutely wild. I can't say that this is something that is really disappointing to me, because to think of like the next Guilty Gear that comes after this to be even like easier to play, you know what? I'm down for it, right? If they want to make Guilty Gear thrive, and it comes out in a few years from now, Guilty Gear Strive has been existing for like 5 years, like, oh man, okay, so they make Guilty Gear thrive, and character moves are even easier to do. They take away half circle back forward motions, and oh god, like all this legacy stuff that has existed for a long time, and it's gone now. And now there's just not even fireball motions. Oh shit, Guilty Gear Thrive has DNF dual style inputs. Ah fuck, they go full on DNF dual on this shit. But the next game looks amazing, and then it also proposes completely new ways to play it, like very different than Guilty Gear Strive, very different than previous Guilty Gear games. Feels like a completely different game, and I'm like fighting with characters in ways that I've never even seen them do shit before. I'm okay with that, because that would technically classify as simplified but expanded. If they find a way to actually expand, you know, the franchise, much less anything else that they're working on, I'm cool with it. But if this is just like another regression, it's the previous game, but we made less things that you have to think about. For the majority of people, especially a casual audience, that is usually not just the thing that'll sell it. If, for example, Guilty Gear Strive looked not that much different than the previous game, came out and it's just simpler to play, and now everyone's gonna jump online, I don't think that is like the thing that makes fighting games super appealing. I think it's about several different elements coming together between roster, visuals, presentation, and content. That's what actually sells millions upon millions of units of fighting games. Guilty Gear Strive, it was a wonderful example of right place, right time. Like these games are ultimately video games, not just tools to beat ass. And to be like, and to hear it from Daisuke like directly, that the thing I wish I can do next time is just make it simpler. Instead of, you know, let's actually make a story mode that you can play. Give characters proper arcade endings, and maybe something like Grand Blue has, where it's like an adventure mode or something like that. Like, to me, that is the kind of shit that you would want to do to bring people in. That's kind of the stuff that would work. And ultimately, and here's my big criticism of what he's saying here, because it's not even really a criticism, because this might not be just about gameplay. This might not be about gameplay. Fighting games in particular have a high bar of entry. It's really hard for new people to join in. So if there's something that I can do for the next game, is to make that part easier. Make it easier and simpler for people to be able to just join in the game and really start enjoying fighting games. Great example. Everything there can be solved with making the online fucking work. Everything there can result in an experience that is easier and simpler if the online system and the way you fight other people is fast and snappy and works without confusion or weird-ass Habbo hotel lobbies. I still give ArcSys credit. I think that their tower system was a great idea in the first month. How is this going to work when, you know, this version of the game doesn't really have anybody to populate the lower levels anymore, and it just doesn't? It's really cool in some ways because it focuses all the people to play the right people at the right time, but ultimately fails in the longer overhaul, right? As things play on. And this is beyond my personal gripes where I just can't fucking play the game because my stupid machine I'm at breaks when people click on it too much. If you apply these concepts to all that other stuff, and not like quality of life, and not just like, oh, we're gonna just have punch and kick now, and oh, we're also gonna have only 3 special moves per character, so you don't have to worry about it too much. But we're gonna add back, you know, insta-kills. Like, oh, man. Just, man. To me, that would be actually depressing. Like, that would be where it's like, oh, the game for, like, the Guilty Gear professionals ends up being, like, Guilty Gear Strive. And Guilty Gear Strive is an insanely feature-rich, mechanically dense game that, you know, people are really critical about because it's significantly less than some of the previous games. Now that one is the huge mechanically dense game. It's like, I just want Guilty Gear to be different, right? I just like sequels, follow-ups to fighting games to present ideas that are different than the previous games, which is why games like Street Fighter 6 and Tekken 8 look so appealing, because they're really trying to shape things up.